Fygla's People, an original short story by Thomas Sharp. Alone, amongst the windswept, desolate moors of North Yorkshire, John Chadwick, his horse trudging beneath him, made his way through the now brown, spiny heather, having long since lost its rich purple flower it bore when he first saw so many months ago. The ceaseless wind and rain chilled him to what could only be his soul. Avoiding pools of foetid water that reeked of decay, the pair picked their way across the seemingly endless expanse. He had been ordered to this bleak part of the world to collect taxes from the broken and weary people of Yorkshire's coastal towns and villages, a job he did not embrace with the gusto he had of his previous position, working in the warm, friendly areas around London. This place was remote, a place where maps are never needed, as no one from outside ever goes there, and anyone from there already knows the way. As the wind whipped past him in another blustery gale, he had a stark recollection of an interaction he had had in the last hotel he had stayed in, a town larger than his current destination, but smaller than the parks he had played in London. The landlady, obviously not keen on his profession, had refused him firewood. At this time of year, did she want him to freeze? Along with the constant squawk of the seagulls, this place was becoming incredibly tiresome and irritating. He looked at his watch and longed for his apartment back in Camden, where his loving wife would be sat by a roaring fire, various maids and servants seeing to her every whim. He was reminded as to why he had never been this far north before. A faint scent of rotting seaweed let John know he was nearing his destination. It turned his stomach and made him long to be back further inland, away from this god-forsaken coastline and its people. As the horse trudged toward the moor's edge, the terrain abruptly dropped away before him, revealing a nightmarish vista. A colossal, bowl-shaped depression with one side missing, as if nature herself had gouged out a portion of the earth. A shiver ran down his spine, and any hint of amusement vanished from his thoughts. What monstrous force could demand such an enormous chasm? It was a question that sent a chill through him as he surveyed the desolate expanse before him. He dismounted his horse, so better to take in the view and see if he could find a way down, then out of a faint fog. He spotted the village, nestled in a little crevasse in the center of the bowl, right on the edge of the coastline. A collection of small white and grey cottages grew out of the crevasse. Their red-tiled roofs resembled bloodstains frozen in time. The village had been untouched by the outside world, seemingly forgotten by time itself. Though the rain had abated slightly, the route down he had spotted still looked treacherous. Lots of slick, muddy ground and prickly gorse bushes would make the journey in or out of this place ghastly. Who in their right mind would choose to live here? He thought to himself. Further out in the middle of the bay loomed a massive, ovate-shaped island. It was hard to tell, but from this distance it looked deceptively smooth, and no ripples were formed in the water around the island. It had a strange, otherworldly feel to it that filled John with profound unease and gnawed upon the back of his mind. It was hard not to stare at the object, and it felt like it was staring back, two red eyes, into his mind, into his soul. He shuddered a chilling shiver down his spine, filling him with an inexplicable sense of dread. His horse whinnied next to him, obviously not interested in being stood in constant drizzle. This shook him from his malaise, and he took it by the reins, got on its back, and started down the path into the village. With each step down the treacherous slope, the route seemed to get more difficult. His heart began to pound harder, and his grip tightened on the reins till his knuckles were white. Every few meters the path would twist and seemingly disappear behind thick gorse bushes or ferns. The plants themselves seemed to move and shroud the route as if not wanting anyone to use it. As the pair grew closer, his horse seemed to get more startled and afraid. He had dismounted partway down the hill from being forcibly dismounted by the disgruntled animal. Moments later the horse had slipped down a muddy embankment and thrown a shoe. He himself had tripped over several roots that seemed to emerge just as his feet went over them. One had caused him to trip and bang his head on a rock, making him see white for a second, though he was sure he saw 4 deep red eyes staring at him from inside his mind. Approaching the outskirts of the village, he noticed a distinct lack of noise, be it from the village people who are normally bartering, arguing, and just generally existing in a constant working-class din. or the ceaseless din of the seabirds that infest these rural coastal areas. Yet here there was no din, no noise at all, other than the squelch of his boots and the lame gait of his horse. No seagulls either, he noted. Now that is a blessing. I shall have to find out how the locals keep them infernal creatures at bay. The distinct smell of seaweed had grown now, to the point John could taste it at the back of his throat. He thought of what wretched creatures could tolerate such an abhorrent stench crossed his mind. As John entered the village, he felt he was being watched, yet no one was anywhere to be seen. No smoke rose from the chimneys, and all the drying racks were bare. Several odd boxes laid about the place. John didn't know why they were odd. There was just something about them. Their geometry didn't quite seem to line up properly. John continued deeper into the village looking for someone when he saw a young boy scrabbling about with some of the strange boxes. From his dirty, rugged appearance, he was obviously a local. "You there? Where might I find someone in charge?" yelled John. The boy stopped immediately in his tracks and slowly turned his head at what seemed to be an unnatural angle to stare at John, then abruptly lifted his arm and pointed past John. Turning, John saw a large group of the villagers standing in the road no more than 10 meters away. Strangely, he hadn't noticed them or heard their approach. They were all dressed in various rags, and their shaggy hair obscured their faces, but John saw some common traits amongst them. Inbreeding, he thought, not uncommon in these backwaters. As he approached the villagers, they started to peel away in a strange, coordinated manner. All of them were deathly silent. By the time John had got to where the villagers had been standing, nearly all of them had returned to whatever hovel they had come from, and only one was left. "I am John Chadwick of London. I am here to collect the taxes the village owes to your king." John greeted the man, raising his hand. The man raised a hand and ushered John to follow, pointing at the horse, presumably meaning to leave it. John followed the mute down into the crevasse, into the depths of the village. All the houses in the village were butted up to one another with no visible gaps between them, all leaning off the walls of the fissure, almost jeering with one another to see which one could lean the furthest from their protective grip on the wall. At the end of a steep, winding bank lined with dozens of such houses, the area opened up. John could see several little cobble boats the locals took out fishing. Oddly, they all seemed to be in harbour, but in the prior places he had visited, the locals had been very staunch about going out in all weathers. This must have been the dock. He could make out a small slipway for getting the boats into the ocean and the beach off just beyond that. The mute then abruptly stopped and looked out at the sea. His jaw slacked open and drool started coming out. John followed where the man was looking and saw something he wished he hadn't. It was the island again. As soon as he set eyes on it, the throbbing in his head from the fall got worse. A deep nausea rose from within him. He could see the eyes again, this time stronger, piercing through his conscious mind and into his soul. He shut his eyes and blacked out. John awoke with a start. The image of the eyes still burned into his mind. He was quickly knocked out of his malaise by the crackle of a nearby fire along with the smell of burning wood. He took a second to get his bearings and looked around the room he was in. It was a modest, lime-washed room with very little furniture bar the bed he was on, a small table in the corner, and a more than adequate fireplace. Heating the room, he also noticed a smaller version of the strange boxes he had seen. The geometry still hurt his mind. He finally extricated himself from his bed, where the sheets had grasped him far tighter than was normal. As he sat up, a wave of confusion washed over him. "Where am I?" he wondered aloud, his voice echoing in the quiet room. Looking down at himself, he noticed he was just in his undergarments and had a quick look around to make sure he was truly alone. A glance towards the window, and he could see out to sea. The cliffs of nearby Ravenscar were clearly visible, jutting out into the night. A few more steps, and he knew the odd island would be in view. He resisted the urge to look. John surveyed the room and found his belongings neatly arranged, including the tax collection funds he had brought with him. Such hospitality in this peculiar place, he mused, a shiver running down his spine as he considered the uncanny precision with which everything had been prepared. Alongside his possessions was a small piece of bread and a decanter of what he presumed to be wine. He picked the bread up to take a bite, but as he did, he saw maggots writhing beneath it. The sight turned his stomach and he stepped away. After putting on some clean clothes that had been laid out on the floor for him in a very odd manner, John left his room. Halfway down the landing, he was shaken by a sense of dread. There was no sound coming from downstairs. Every other bar he had been to had always been bustling centers of the local community. Here it was deathly silent. Descending the creaking staircase, John felt an almost oppressive silence enveloping the tavern. The barkeep, an enigmatic figure with an oddly shaped beard, turned to acknowledge him. The room was devoid of conversation, and John's footsteps echoed ominously as he approached the bar. All the patrons had their heads slightly tilted towards John, just enough so they could see him, but he could not make out any of their features. John sat and broke bread with the owner of the tavern, discussing some local history and politics. He seemed to be the only person in the entire bar that could talk. Every other patron just sat in silence, neither eating or drinking. Occasionally one would leave, and John swore he saw the same man enter a matter of moments later. John had a general sense of unease. Of course, people being silent in bars was odd, but the stranger thing to him was the welcoming nature of the owner. Not many in John's line of work got any pleasantries from the patrons they ply their trade on. John had noted the only person who was moving about in the place was the serving girl, but she seemed to move between tables doing nothing, almost as if she was an automaton. John finally summoned up the courage to ask about the tax bill. "Who should I talk to about this?" handing over a small letter with the king's seal on it. "You will want to go see the shopkeeper about that," he replied, glancing at the timepiece on the wall. "Mind you, she shuts soon. You can always see her tomorrow." "I would prefer to get it done now. Get it done and dusted, out of the way." The owner begrudgingly gave John the directions to the shop, and John thanked him graciously. Upon leaving the tavern, John could feel a sense of dread. He was being watched again. He looked up at the tavern. Each window had several faces staring down at him through fogged glass. He pushed up his jacket collar to brace against the stiff sea wind and set off into the village. The directions John had been given to the shop seemed rather convoluted for somewhere that appeared on the surface to be little more than one street, but on closer inspection, John found small alleyways between several of the houses, some only broad enough for a single person to pass through. Everywhere John looked, more houses and more alleys appeared. He was glad he had directions, as he could have been lost in here for hours otherwise. As he delved deeper into the maze-like warren, these people called a home. The sense of dread came back. He was being watched, but much more closely this time. Several times he startled himself when he turned a corner to see someone grotesquely staring out of a window at him. He was sure that some of the eyes had a faint red glow to them, but he shrugged off the idea as lunacy. It was starting to turn dark, so he upped his pace. Getting close to the last corner, he was startled when he bumped into the tavern owner, or at least he thought he was. The man looked the same, but was subtly different. He was about to confront the man on sending him the long way. When the man shuffled off with haste, carrying another of the strange boxes, he thought to follow the man, but then he saw the dim light of the shop, and remembered his true mission lie within. As John approached the shop, the sun had finally set, and the wind that always follows a rainstorm on these coasts sent a chill running down his spine. Shivering, he climbed into the shop front and was met by a young lady, one whom he was certain he had seen cleaning tables in the bar. "Are these people taking me for a ride, or are they all severely attracted to their own families?" he thought to himself. "Good evening, ma'am. I swear I saw you in the tavern earlier. Please tell me I am not going mad," he said jovially to her. She glanced at John, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I haven't been in for weeks, not had the time," she replied abruptly. She clearly had a lot going on, looking at the state of the shop that was in complete disarray. John leaned on the counter and presented the letter with the king's seal. "I'm here to inquire about the taxes for the local area. Is everything in order?" he asked, keeping his tone businesslike. She hesitated for a moment, then pulled a small box from beneath the counter. "I think you will find everything here," she said cryptically, her eyes flicking towards the box. "By the way, is it your horse at the top of the bank? Looks like it's thrown a shoe. Sadly, the blacksmith is away on business at the moment." Taking the box the woman had given him, John left the store and started back to the tavern. Once again, the feeling of being watched was surrounding him. Several times he glanced down darkened alleys to see the local fisherwives staring back at him. He was certain he could see a faint red glow coming from their eyes, but he was tired. People's eyes didn't glow. Crossing the dock that the tavern was on, John fought the urge to look out over the sea into the gloom that had set in. He knew the island was there. He could feel it boring into his mind. He resisted. Upon entering the front door of the tavern, he slammed the door shut behind himself, shivering but unsure whether from the cold or the thought of that dreadful island. He headed straight to the bar, ordered a drink and sat down to contemplate his fate. How was he going to get out of here? It was nearly 14 miles to the next town. He couldn't do that in the dark. He would have to stay the night. With nothing else to do with his evening, he settled down next to the fire with his drink. Once again noting all of the other patrons were silent, and all of them had one eye on him. John lingered in the bar for a few hours, getting increasingly full on both food and beer. With each bite and each slurp, he glanced around at his fellow patrons, looking to see if they had moved. As time wound on, he was sure they were all slowly standing up, looking to loom over him, oppressing him. Then he saw her, the shopkeeper, or the woman whom the shopkeeper had claimed not to be. He stood, and while she wasn't looking, he abruptly moved towards her, picking up a small kitchen knife from a table he passed and grabbed her arm. He was expecting her to squeal, but the alcohol in his system had dulled his sense of reason enough, and he was an official of the king. If these people were playing tricks, he must know why. She didn't squeal or scream. She did something much worse. A viscous black substance came gurgling out of her mouth. Her eyes went bright red. In shock, he immediately let go. His hand felt funny. Glancing down, he noticed that her flesh was slick with a viscous green glowing liquid. He let go and stepped back in shock. Upon hearing the creak of a floorboard behind him, John's senses swam back into his head. The sense of dread tightened around his heart. He took a deep gulp and turned to see what had made the noise, knowing full well what it was he was going to see. Even knowing something doesn't make it true, what John beheld truly terrified him. All the villagers had abandoned their silent observation and now moved towards him with an erosive determination. All of their faces were the same, not just similar, identical. No sooner had John scanned the crowd, recognizing them all to be the same person. They all started to morph. Their flesh seemed to drip away from their body, coalescing into a writing fleshy tentacle on the floor. No sooner had it formed. It started to split, glancing up at what was left of the crowd. John saw their eyes bulging into lidless black orb, the remnants of their limbs contorted and fusing, elongating into grotesque pulsating tendrils. Their now fleshless mouths contorted and merged into a revolting tangle of writhing, puckering suckers. How or why the moonlight had performed this unholy alchemy on these vile creatures, John did not know. He had to escape. That was it. That was all he knew. Keeping a firm grasp on the knife he had acquired, he turned as if to run out of the main door. No sooner had he made the turn, the door flew open. The barman, or someone who looked remarkably like him, stood in the threshold behind him. A writhing mass of tentacles could be seen. The entire village must be infected, thought John. At that moment, John recalled a trap door near the base of the stairs. Presumably it led to a cellar of some sort. Maybe that had another way out. Without another thought, John scrambled for the cellar door, lifted it up, and without even looking, threw himself down through the hole into the darkness. John landed hard and wet. He was next to running water. This was no cellar. It was the stream he had seen earlier. He tried to stand up, but the slick, slimy surface made John fall again, banging his head on the way down. He saw white again, and the eyes, 6 red eyes gleaming out of the dark. He shook off the thoughts and crawled down the gully. He spotted one of the strange boxes he had seen around the village earlier. He slid over to it as quietly as he could, and opened it and saw a horrifying sight. A grotesque collection of eerie, pulsating green eggs, each about the size of a teapot. Their eerie, otherworldly glow seemed to cast a sickly pallor upon everything around them. As he stared closer, terror gripped his heart as he realized the eggs were translucent. Something unspeakably sinister writhed and squirmed inside. John, realizing the danger he was in, rolled into the fast-flowing water next to him, not sure what lay at the end, but hoping it was fairer than the sights he had seen above himself in the tavern. Grasping for fingerholes, he slid down the gully for what could only have been a very brief period before being ejected back onto the beach, its golden sand now white from the moon. No sooner had he landed, he looked up towards the tunnel he had come from. A writhing mass of tentacles and suckers emerged from the tunnel, each acting independently, each acting together. A thick mist followed them. He could not see what they were attached to, if anything at all. Looking up and around, he noticed pairs of red eyes in nearly every window of every house that overlooked the bay, all staring at him, following his every move. Then he heard it, not with his ears, but with his mind. A deep, thick rumble from behind him, a timeless rumbler from the island, a primal rumbly that felt older than the very foundations of the cliffs around him. He felt not to look back at the 8 glowing red ears burning into the back of his mind. He had to get out. He had to escape. He ran for the slipway. It was the only way off the beach. He might have to run through the village, but it was better than facing whatever had made that noise. It was overgrown and slick seaweed, which made the ascension incredibly precarious. As he neared the top, moonlight faded. Darkness enveloped the village, as if summoned by some other worldly being. Clouds formed out of nowhere and opened into what must have been reminiscent of the biblical flood. The sickening slop and squelch resounded once more, and he dared not cast a glance in that direction. He knew all too well what lurked below on that wretched beach, those infernal creatures, abominations that defied nature itself. With pounding feet and a racing heart, the torrential rain streaming down making it near impossible to see, John plunged into the night-shrouded village. The narrow alleyways twisted and turned, merging and splitting, reminiscent of the foul creatures that followed him. He was ascending out of the village, each step making his heartbeat quicken, his feet echoing a rhythm that drove him to flee the clutches of those unholy aurors lurking in the dark abyss below, an echo with no return. John finally reached the top of the crevasse the village he occupied. Thick fog was billowing between the houses, seemingly dampened by the heavy rainfall. He could see the movement of the tentacle creatures writing like maggots feasting in a wound, their appendages lashing out at the rain as if it burnt them. Passing the last few scattered buildings outlying the village, he saw his horse, dead on the floor, strange marks around its neck. It had obviously been strangled. This filled him with an even greater sense of dread. He had been hoping to be able to ride the horse for at least a little bit out of the village to get him further away from his assailants. He could sense the eyes watching him, not the villagers or the creatures they became, but the 4 glowing red eyes from the depths. The slick rain was making it hard for John to gain purchase on the slippery surfaces outside the village. He took out the knife and used it to slick into the mud or between rocks to aid his ascent. He scrambled over walls and under bushes, tripping on roots and potholes. He finally reached the brow of the hill, slick with mud and blood from climbing through the gorse on his ascent. Then, as abruptly as they had appeared, the clouds dispersed, lighting up the surrounding area with the bright glow of the moon. He turned to look, to see where his pursuers were. Nothing. They had all but disappeared, and the little village sat in silence again, as it had been when he arrived. He looked for the island, though the mortal part of his soul screamed not to. It had disappeared. The 2 red eyes in John's mind blinked shut, only ripples left in their wake. Thank you for listening to my story. Please like, subscribe and share if you enjoyed.